James Gunn's Superman is officially here. Years after we found out that James Gunn would be heading DC Studios going forward to build the DCU and that he would be taking on Superman. And after months of hype and build-up and marketing and trailers and controversies thrown in here or there, the movie is finally here. I was able to watch it last night at one of the Amazon Prime member screenings that they did in a handful of theaters all around the country. And I'm going to give my thoughts. Before I do, I want to preface it. I'm going to try to keep it spoiler-free, at least for the majority of it. If I do get into spoilers, I will let you know beforehand. But going into this movie, I have to say I felt kind of strange because most comic book movies, one way or the other, I feel I'm really going to like this or I'm really going to hate this. The marketing for this movie, the interviews surrounding it, nothing really got me excited for this movie, but I also wasn't looking at these trailers and be like, I absolutely despise this. It's not how I felt. I felt very meh going into the movie. And unfortunately for me, that's kind of how I felt after I watched it as well. For people that had concerns about some of the headlines and the way that this was being talked about as, oh, it's about politics, and it's an immigration allegory and stuff like that, I do have good news for you on that front. All of that stuff is barely present and super shallow. Unfortunately, I have bad news for you because the rest of the movie, from the characters to the conversations to the plot lines, they're also rather shallow. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems for the movie. It's a 2-hour-long movie, and it is stuffed. Like, it is stuffed. Things are constantly happening. There's a lot of characters, and it feels like a movie that there was meant to be about 20 more minutes of, and instead of maybe cutting down a plot line or two, they just kind of condensed everything. So when you do get some good things, when you do get some maybe good conversation between Superman and Lois, it feels like you want a lot more than you end up getting. And in typical James Gunn fashion, when you do have these small moments where it does take itself seriously, which is a little bit rare in this movie, it doesn't often take itself all that seriously because it's a James Gunn movie. The moments where it does take itself seriously are almost immediately undercut by some sort of joke. The movie itself feels like, hey, these are the criticisms that some people had for Man of Steel and Henry Cavill and Zack Snyder's Superman. We are going to overcorrect, and we're not going to take ourselves seriously at all. That's the way it feels to me. I don't know if everyone's going to take it that way, and maybe for some people, you might love that. That might be exactly what you want. I do feel the movie is going to be a little bit polarizing. I don't know if so many people are going to walk out like me and just be like, meh, didn't love it, didn't hate it, it was fine. I think there's going to be people that absolutely love this movie and hype this movie like crazy. And I think there's going to be some people who feel like this is the worst version of Superman I've ever seen. I feel like I might end up being in the minority here. But let's get to David Corenswet as Superman, as Clark Kent. There is something rather endearing and wholesome about seeing a truly like cartoonish version of Superman on the big screen in live action. They went out of their way to show multiple sequences of Superman specifically saving individual people and even a squirrel at one point in time. And I think those are good things. It's great to see Superman saving somebody. But I also do think that sometimes the way that the character is not just perceived by you, but also by everybody else is just a little bit goofy. It's goofier than it should be. No one takes him seriously for the vast majority of the movie. And considering this is a Superman who's been established for 3 years at this point, if you want to do Superman at the beginning, I get it in those first couple months. 3 years in and no one really takes him seriously, I feel maybe isn't the best depiction of Superman as a whole. And this isn't really a spoiler because it's something we've known is out there. They've talked about it during interviews and marketing and all of this stuff. But the idea of Superman getting upset about things that are being said about him on social media, of course, engineered and pushed out there a lot by a plan Lex Luthor has, and the leaks about that were true, just so you know, won't get into specifics, but the leaks about that were true. It's present, but it is very, again, just like everything, they barely touch on it. They mention it a handful of times, and that's it. They don't really delve into it. And I wish that we would have gotten to see a little bit before how everyone looks at Superman before, how everyone's treating Superman before these things start getting pushed out there and before he starts getting criticized. So maybe you can see how and why it's affecting him the way that it is, other than him just having having a meltdown about hashtags on social media, which just seems, maybe it's modern day Superman, but it doesn't seem very Superman to me. I like a lot of the kindness that's being displayed, and I like his passion for saving everyone. I love that stuff. I think it could have been balanced with a little more stoicism at times than the goofy way that he's consistently portrayed. And one of the things that people noticed from the trailers that did play off in this, it seems like Superman is getting his shit kicked out of him a lot, and he is. Now, they preface it with with saying, hey, he's been Superman for 3 years since he revealed himself to the world, and he's never lost a battle until now, kind of thing. But it does feel like he's, even throughout this movie, constantly getting bailed out by other people, which I think it could have been balanced. Again, if maybe you had shown some of the way that Superman is before we start getting into this arc, before he starts getting engineered the stuff on social media to call him out, before some of this stuff is happening, I think that could have been great to see how everyone viewed Superman immediately before this stuff started happening and before he lost for the first time, before a lot of the criticism started happening. I think the movie really would have benefited from that. The relationship and the dynamic between Superman and Lois, I think there is some good stuff in there. Unfortunately, we only really have a handful of conversations between these characters because the story is just so stuffed and there's so much going on. I like Rachel Brosnahan as Lois. I like her a lot as Lois Lane. And I think they have a good dynamic between them where she is question everything, question everybody, very skeptical, heavy with the skepticism and cynicism. Whereas Superman always sees the good in everybody, always wants to give everyone a chance, always wants to save everybody. I think that them having that dynamic is interesting and you can do some cool stuff with that. But sometimes when you start to get in and you start making a good point and a great little bit of back and forth between them, there's a random joke in the background that's supposed to be played off for comedic effect, and it kind of undercuts everything. Nicholas Hoult as Lex Luthor seems uneven to me. The tone throughout the whole movie actually seems uneven to me in a way. Like I said, because there are moments when you think the movie's about to try to take itself seriously, and then often it doesn't. So there's a lot of differing tones throughout. But Nicholas Holt's Lex Luthor, there were moments when I loved him as Lex Luthor. But I feel like throughout, I don't know if it was in the script. I don't know if it was maybe because of a couple of reshoots. I'm not exactly sure, but it felt like at times they didn't really know what they wanted the character to do. Do we want him to just be this cold, calculated villain? Or then at times being portrayed as a little bit more unhinged, not really as in control as he wants to be. It was just a little bit off for me. And even him crying at one point, which I don't necessarily need to see Lex Luthor crying over what he was crying about. That, to me, was a little bit disappointing because I love Nicholas Hoult as an actor. I think he's fantastic, and I think at moments he's great in this. But even at the end, Superman has after the culmination of basically the story, and Superman, has this little monologue that he's giving Luthor, and Luthor's about to come back at him, and then it gets undercut for comedic effect. And you're like, man, right, okay, that's funny, I guess, but I really wish we could have seen this. Krypto is all over this movie. And I think families and women are going to love Krypto. And I don't mind the idea of Krypto and a couple, elements of it thrown in there. He's all over the movie. And I think at times it's just a little much. Like I said, it's tough to take it seriously at times. And Krypto doesn't take Superman seriously, just like nobody does. But I guess that's just the way it is in this universe. Almost no one takes Superman seriously. One of the interesting things to me, the idea that this movie was clearly made to be like, all right, we're going to move away from the Zack Snyder DC Superman. We're going to move away from Henry Cavill's Superman. But they end up repeating a lot of the same plot points in terms of, how governments around the world would react to Superman intervening in this or intervening in that. They're repeating some of these plot points about, this idea of an alien. Does he really have our best interest at heart? Blah, blah, blah. They're repeating these talking points. But because they do it in such a nonchalant, shallow way, you can't take it seriously. So I think it actually does a worse job. And I know people are going to have their criticisms of those movies. Certainly. They have for years. But I don't think this improves on it. I think it just doesn't take it seriously, but tries to throw in those plot points anyway. When it comes to the Justice Gang, Mr. Terrific's the only one that got, I feel like, a significant amount of screen time. And I actually did like his character. I think they did a good job with the look. I think they did a good job with him in general and the stuff he did. Maybe I didn't need the big quintessential James Gunn 360 fight scene with Mr. Terrific. Probably didn't need that. But other than that, I think he fits okay into the movie. Guy Gardner and Hawkgirl, I felt like there's not even enough of them. A couple of Guy Gardner jokes are like, okay, that's not bad. But it felt like it was kind of unnecessary for them to be in the movie. They do something very important right at the end. But overall, it's just another handful of characters that get thrown in there that we don't get much of. I could say the same thing about the rest of the Daily Planet staff. Jimmy Olsen has a little bit of a side plot, which is important. But then you get down to the end, and we've seen it in the shots in the trailers of Lois Lane, driving Mr. Terrific's ship and the entire Daily Planet staff in the back. And again, what they do is impactful, but the scene itself, the fact that they needed to be there, the fact that she needed to be flying the ship off for them seemed a little bit forced. And overall, I wish we could have maybe spent useful time doing other things and fleshing out some other stuff instead of having that sequence. But they take all these characters, Perry, Cat Grant, like Jimmy, they take all these characters, they throw them in there. And there's not a ton of it, but they're all present, which, again, it makes it feel stuffed in a way. The little Metamorpho plot line and, Metamorpho's baby and all of this stuff, it felt incredibly rushed. And I don't necessarily want to get into spoilers at this point yet, but I thought Metamorpho looked really good. And it was really interesting to see the use of his powers in live action and stuff like that. But also a lot of his specific portion of the movie, a lot of humor, a lot of attempts at comedic effect. And I think it undercuts things a little bit. I think the use of the baby is almost a cheap trick that doesn't really work to get you invested. Like, why you're supposed to care about this, but you can also tell it's like a cheap trick to get a cheap pop. And the Metamorpho thing, I wish we had more time. I wish we would have had more time with him and Superman before what happens. Overall, cool to see him, but a little bit of a disappointing appearance in totality. And I think so far I've kept this mostly spoiler-free. My overall feelings, before I get into just a handful of spoilers that I want to touch on, my general feelings are, I feel like the movie is supposed to be goofy, fun, not too serious. Let's get a little bit of hope and inspiration and watch the good guy always try to do the right thing. And I don't necessarily hate that. I just wish we had more, because I think there's potential, and I think there's plot lines you can do, and I think there's stuff you can talk about where you have so much more potential that if you had let that happen, and if you had given things a little bit more room to breathe and expand on some of those ideas, then you could have had a banger of a movie. But instead we get something that feels a little bit goofy, a little bit overly cartoonish, an overcorrection of sorts, something that's rather shallow, and ultimately something that I think some people are going to go in, they're going to feel like it's just too crowded, just too packed. There's just too much stuff going on. And the big twist that they give you at the end is completely telegraphed, and it was tell, don't show type of stuff. So those are my overall thoughts. I feel very meh. I think the movie's fine. I think some people are going to go in, if you're just looking for kind of good, dumb, goofy fun, you don't want to take it seriously, you might go in here and absolutely love this movie. If you're looking for a little bit more, or if you see a lot of the missed opportunities that they could have had, you're probably going to walk out rather disappointed in the movie. A few spoilers that I want to touch on. If you're expecting any massive cameos that weren't part of the marketing, if you think Batman's you should just stop thinking that that's gonna be the case. There is a small cameo at the end, which we kind of already knew about anyway. They've got another movie in the works with Supergirl, and randomly on a news interview, John Cena shows up, just complaining about Superman, basically. But one thing that they do in this movie that I fucking hated, and that's why I wanted to say this for the spoiler, because you do have to get into it a little bit. Early on in the movie, very early on, they show Superman at the Fortress of Solitude when he's getting healed, and they're playing the clip from his parents, right? That his parents left him when they sent him there. And it got damaged, so we didn't see the end of it. But essentially, it's saying, hey, we're sending you here. We hope that you can serve humanity, do great things, be incredible, give them hope, whatever. But he never heard the end of the message. Lex Luthor breaks into the Fortress of Solitude using Ultraman, who is a clone of Superman. Again, like I said, spoilers. That was so telegraphed. And there were leaks out there about this, so if you really had been paying attention, you probably knew anyway. But holy shit, I feel like they didn't even really try to make it a twist. But that's another criticism that I do have. And he gets the full message. It turns out in the full message that then gets leaked and Lex Luthor does an interview to broadcast to everybody, in this full message, after saying, hey, we're sending you there, hope you do good things, blah, 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 they say, oh, by the way, you should essentially take over the human race. They're weak. They're stupid. You should take them over. You should breed with as many of them as possible. You should take as many wives as you can to spread Kryptonian seed. This is what his parents told him. And I'm thinking the entire time, okay, yes, I get it. They're saying it's verified. They're saying it's real. This is like crushing to Superman because he thought that he was sent here to do what he's doing as Superman. But in reality, his parents are telling him something completely fucked up. He wants him to dominate and take over because humans are weak and blah, blah, blah. Just spread your seed, spread the superior Kryptonian gene all over. And that's like heartbreaking to him. And it creates a problem for him. And then he goes back at some point, he has to go back home to Ma and Pa Kent. And, Pa Kent has a nice little aside with him where he talks to him about how, it doesn't matter. You aren't your parents, regardless of who we are. Your actions, your decisions, that's what makes you who you are. And good moment there. I thought it was a good, solid moment. But I was expecting that it was just going to be some scheme, that Lex actually had planned all of this, that Lex actually had, forged these things, and that would eventually come out. No, it's not forged. It's real. Jor-El literally said these things to Superman. Superman's dad sent him there to dominate fucking planet Earth. And that to me is just so out of left field and unnecessary because you could have had all the plot that you wanted. Superman feeling conflicted about this, Superman feeling like shit about this, Superman having this crisis because what he'd always thought he was sent here to do gets completely turned upside down. And then you could reveal that, no, it's actually a scheme. It's actually fake. None of that happened. And still maintain this idea of, Superman's parents, his actual birth parents. But no, they just completely said, fuck that. They're pieces of shit. They want you to dominate. Go fuck them. That was really wild to me. I think it's completely unnecessary and there's no purpose for it. Because you could achieve the same thing while saying that they faked something, that they forged something, whatever, without actually undercutting Superman's birth parents, like his Kryptonian heritage in that way. I think that was very strange. Overall, I think the movie is okay. And if this was like the baseline, if we could get back to this being the baseline for superhero movies, right, where it's just kind of a little bit dumb, goofy, maybe doesn't take itself very seriously, is just intended to be fun. If this was the baseline for like what we felt as the low tier for comic book movies, I think that would be a great thing, actually. It's too often that's not the case anymore. Unfortunately, I think that with a character like this, with a character like Superman, with so much writing on this for the rebirth of the DC universe, I do feel like it's a little bit of a letdown. Maybe not for me personally, because like I said, I wasn't too hyped going in. But I think the standard for this character and the standard for kicking off, I think it should be higher. I have no idea how it's going to perform at the box office. But for me, I don't love it. I don't hate it. I don't really like it. It was a fine movie. And I think there's going to be some families and kids and stuff like that that probably really do love it. And hopefully they do. But for me, overall, very whelming. It was a whelming film. Wasn't overwhelmed, wasn't underwhelmed. It's just kind of It's there. It's super meh. It's James Gunn's super meh. That's how it feels to me. And I think the standard should be higher for a character like this. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section below. Smash a like button, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, share this video out there, and I'll talk to you later.